Some of you may be aware of a YouTuber named TIK, who is mostly known for his military history videos. Recently, he has dabbled into political and economic history, making a fool of himself in the process. In fact, he has made such a fool of himself that even some of his own patrons have begged him to stick to videos about tanks and battles.
Many of my critics have told me to stick to tanks. Stick to tanks, stick to tanks, stick to counting tanks. Oh, and neck yourself. This was, of course, until I pointed out to them that I don't do tank videos. At which point, the narrative changed to stick to military history. Stick to military history, stick to military history, stick to military history. Well, recently one of my patrons has asked me to stick to tanks, although he didn't say that exactly. Uncle Joe Stalin, he recently changed the name Stalin to an S, has said this. Hi TIK, here's my Q&A question. Why is more and more time being used for political speeches these days instead of your superior military content that we love? Please don't say it's to give context. The political content has kept growing. 95% of it does not give any meaningful context, and it's starting to get out of hand. Let's stay on point at TIK. Thanks, Brian, Uncle Joe Stalin.
Now, I don't think the majority of these people are doing this out of spite. Some of them, such as the patron, seem to be big fans of TIK, but are rightly appalled at how ridiculous his videos on politics are. He became popular by making detailed and thoughtful videos on military campaigns and historical battles. I doubt anyone signed up to listen to rants about how Lord Keynes was a Marxist socialist.
Wait a second. Rosa Luxemburg, Bukharin, Sombart, Keynes, and Marx? But these are all Marxist socialists.
Or how Augusto Pinochet was not a true pro-capitalist dictator because he had a state-funded army.
Pinochet supposedly brought in capitalism, except he didn't. The fact that he's a dictator, that taxes were still forcefully collected rather than volunteered, and the fact that there was a state army should be proof enough.
Or how British universities are dominated by Marxist intellectuals.
But, unfortunately, those who control the past control the future, and the Marxists control the past. Since the Cold War era, if not much earlier, socialists have invaded the universities and have been miseducating the youth. Think about it. Who writes the history books? Public socialised state academic historians. And who teaches in these public socialised state schools? People who believe in socialised state control of the means of production. These socialised state historians and these socialised state academics have the most to gain from a further expansion of the public socialised state sector. So they're pushing a false narrative of history, a false narrative of the news, a false definition of the words we use in everyday language, like state. All as a way of defending real socialism, the state.
Sounds more like a conspiracy theorist than a proper historian. Now, of course, TIK has not taken the criticism well, and has basically doubled down. Recently, he released another video which is 5 hours long that once again demonstrates his abysmal understanding of economics and history. Just listen to his definition of capitalism.
The word private comes from the Latin privus, meaning individual, as in individual human being. This is why a private in the army is a single soldier. Private control also means non-state. Capitalism is anti-state, since it gives individuals or small family-like groups control of their means of production. Capitalism is against, or at least not in favour of, publicly owned corporations, publicly owned central banks, or publicly owned central states. This is why the term state capitalism is oxymoronic, since capitalism is inherently non-state. This term, state capitalism, literally means state non-state.
Now, this appalling definition flies in the face of history. During the 18th century, common land in Britain was transformed into private property by the Enclosure Acts, which were passed by the British Parliament. So the state granted the rights of exclusive ownership to the lord of the manor, whilst taking away the traditional rights of the peasantry, who were once allowed to farm the land, forcing many to leave the countryside and look for work in the cities. Of course, since the population of the cities exploded due to this forced expulsion, the state needed to create a police force to keep control of the streets and to, yes, protect private property. As for the definition of capitalism itself, actual, observable, real-world evidence shows that it is characterized by private ownership of the means of production, wage labor, and generalized commodity production, i.e., production for profit. And as history shows, the capitalist economic system requires a strong state in order to work properly. After all, the state is not only used to protect the property of the capitalist class from workers, but also to solve property and trade disputes between other capitalists. Even Adam Smith, who is considered to be the father of laissez-faire capitalism, states in his magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations, that the citizen of every state should give a proportion of their revenue to the government. Quote, "The subjects of every state ought to contribute towards the support of the government as nearly as possible in proportion to their respective abilities, that is, in proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state." Adam Smith also adds, "It is not very unreasonable that the rich should contribute to the public expense, not only in proportion to their revenue, but something more than in that proportion." So if we were to use TIK's absurd definition, Adam Smith, the father of laissez-faire capitalism, would not be a capitalist. As for the term state capitalism, that describes an economy where the state operates the means of production in a capitalist manner, meaning that the state is producing commodities to sell on the market and that labour power is still a commodity. So it's basically still a capitalist economic system where the state acts as the sole capitalist. That is what Marxists mean by state capitalism, which, by the way, is not an oxymoron, but actually the norm for many state-owned industries in capitalist countries today.
There are many different definitions of the word socialism, ranging from collective control, group control, worker control, social control, national control, etc., all of them meaning the same thing: group control of the means of production. And I showed why all groups are non-private, therefore they are public. The word public comes from the Latin publicus, meaning of the people or of the state. This public sector is the hierarchy of society. There can be multiple hierarchies competing against each other, like different local state councils or Soviets, or different corporations which are collectively owned by their shareholders, or multiple trade unions vying for power, but they're all mini-states within the wider society of the central state. Therefore, socialism is the public sector control of the means of production, or state control of the economy.
So according to TIK's definition, all the capitalist states, such as the UK and the US, are actually socialist because private companies are bound by rules and regulations, and are under the protection of the state. Indeed, according to TIK, even companies like Amazon are socialist because they are collectively owned by its shareholders. Yes, everything is socialist and nothing is capitalist. Like I said at the beginning, TIK's videos on politics and economics are beyond ridiculous and do great harm to his credibility.
So these are the historic definitions of capitalism and socialism. But socialists disagree. They deny any definition of socialism and contradict each other in the process. For example, there were 3 socialists who defined socialism at roughly 1 hour and 35 minutes into a debate on one of Sargon of Akkad's videos. The first defined socialism as the collective ownership of the means of production, which he says is the classic Marxist definition. He then lists the Soviet Union, China, Eastern European countries, and Cuba as all socialist countries. His definition is funny because it contradicts at least one of the other socialists in that debate, and the final socialist was so great at defining socialism that he failed to even do so at the time, but later admitted it was working control of the means of production.
First of all, I hardly think that a Sargon of Akkad video is a great source. Secondly, if you actually listen closely to the three socialists, you will find that they agree with the same goal, but advocate different methods. They all want collective ownership of the means of production, elimination of wage labour, production for use instead of for profit, and a classless and stateless society.
But it is true. Socialism is the collective ownership of the means of production. To use Karl Marx's definition for his Marxist version of socialism, socialism is socialized man, the associated producers, rationally regulating their interchange with nature, bringing it under their common control, instead of being ruled by it as by the blind forces of nature. This is a lot of fancy language deliberately designed to hide the true meaning of the words. But as I explained in detail in the public versus private video, the definition is there. To boil it down into plain language, Marx says socialism is a group of people, the workers, controlling the economy together instead of being ruled by the natural economy. In other words, collective control of the means of production. And again, the collective is a group, which is public, which is state. So the word collective is just a word to hide the true meaning of the word state. Socialism, therefore, in its truest and most plainest language definition, is state control of the economy.
This shows that TIK clearly has never read Marx. Marx, despite TIK's claims, did not consider capitalism the natural economic system. In fact, in Capital Volume 1, he writes, "One thing, however, is clear. Nature does not produce on the one side owners of money or commodities, and on the other, men possessing nothing but their own labour power. This relation has no natural basis. Neither is its social basis one that is common to all historical periods. It is clearly the result of a past historical development, the product of many economic revolutions, of the extinction of a whole series of older forms of social production." End quote. TIK is such a great historian that he seems to be unaware of the existence of the feudal period and the slave-driven economies of ancient societies. Now, when Marx talks about the free association of associated producers, he is talking about a post-capitalist stateless society where workers and capitalists have been replaced with associated producers who manage and plan the economy according to need rather than for profit. To be clear, this involves the elimination of private property, commodities, wage labour, exchange value, and value itself. Furthermore, since class antagonisms, formerly between the owners of the means of production and the workers, will be abolished, there will be little need for a state machinery holding such a system together. To quote Engles in The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, "The society which organizes production anew on the basis of free and equal association of the producers will put the whole state machinery where it will then belong, into the Museum of Antiquities, next to the spinning wheel and the bronze axe."
Of course, most socialists don't like to admit that totalitarian state control of the economy is what socialism is, and so they try to hide behind other words. This has got to the point where they even claim socialism is the truest form of democracy, since the people are all supposedly volunteering to submit themselves to the slavery of the central state. This is why Marxist socialist North Korea can call itself democratic, because technically, by the socialist definition, it is democratic. Interestingly, the fascists and the National Socialists also use the exact same logic to claim that their totalitarian socialist dictatorships are also the highest form of democracy.
An utterly false claim. Hitler and Mussolini despised democracy precisely because they associated it with Marxism. In Hitler's infamous address to the capitalists of the Dusseldorf Industrial Club in 1932, he states, "It is absurd to build up economic life on the conceptions of achievement, of the value of personality, and therefore in practice on the authority of personality, but in the political sphere to deny the authority of personality and to thrust into its place the law of the greater number, democracy." Now if you read the whole speech, you will find that he believed that democracy was a threat to capitalist private property and enterprising individuals. This was a speech made in defense of capitalism and an attack on Marxism and democracy. In fact, he also states, "But in the economic sphere, communism is analogous to democracy in the political sphere. We find ourselves today in a period in which these two fundamental principles are at grips in all spheres which come into contact with each other. Already, they are invading economics." So TIK is clearly wrong. What a shock.
Marxist socialists claim to know their ideology inside and out, and say that I don't know what their ideology is, even though I used to be a socialist myself and understand some of their literature better than they do. It turns out that many of them don't know the definition of their own ideology, claiming it has nothing to do with the state, since Marx and Engles said that the state would wither away or die away. But again, I tackled this successfully in the public versus private video. In one hostile response, someone ridiculed me for saying that Marx was calling for anarcho-capitalism. I think he must have missed the very next sentence where I said, "or he's lying." Marx and Engels did say that the state would die away, but there's a couple of things to note. First, it requires the setting up of a totalitarian state in order for the totalitarian state to wither away. Secondly, since a state is of the people, meaning it is the hierarchy of society consisting of the people, when Marx and Engels say that the state will die away, they are literally saying that society will die away too. Which means you no longer have the hierarchy of society, you have anarchism, and you have every individual fending for himself, in control of his own economy.
So let me get this straight. If the state went away, those working in sweatshops, those renting, those living paycheck to paycheck, would be quite happy to maintain the status quo, even though the capitalist class no longer has any backing of the state? How delusional. Do you know what the end of the state would lead to? The end of capitalism and the end of profit. The factories will still probably be running, but will be producing for the needs of the community, rather than profit for the capitalist class, who would most likely lose possession. An entirely new mode of production will replace it. The formerly state-protected private property of the capitalist will be turned into the property of the many. Also, I should point out that the term anarcho-capitalism is an oxymoron.
Marx and Engels are calling for totalitarian state control of society, knowing full well that the state won't wither away at all. They're just promising you that it will. Of course I'll give you $1 million if you watch until the end of the video. Don't worry, keep watching.
Again, Marx and Engels make it clear that the state can only wither away if class antagonisms are done away with. States are, after all, used to repress one class for the benefit of another. Therefore, for the state to wither away, the society must be classless. Now on the road to socialism, the dictatorship of the capitalist class is replaced with the dictatorship of the proletariat. The workers then democratize society by turning the means of production into collective property and creating a democratic government. To quote the manifesto, "We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class to win the battle of democracy." Now in Marx's lifetime, the one government that came close to the dictatorship of the proletariat was the Paris Commune. He praised the Commune for introducing universal suffrage, abolishing the standing army, the state officials, the police, and the state courts. He was also full of praise for the hybrid system of direct and representative democracy they had set up. So to Marx, the dictatorship of the proletariat was a true democracy, designed to represent the entire population, not just the capitalist class.
Many Marxists laughed when I said Hitler was a socialist because he wanted to socialise the people by removing the Jews from society.
People laughed because that claim was totally moronic. Using this logic, Edward I would be socialist because he expelled the Jews from England in 1290. Sadly, anti-Semitic edicts like this were not uncommon in Europe, with Jews being expelled from France and Spain during the Middle Ages.
Marx wanted a worker collective, Hitler wanted a race collective. Marx and Lenin wanted a dictatorship of the proletariat, Hitler wanted a people's state. Marx wanted a class socialism, Hitler wanted a race socialism.
Let's take this at face value and examine it. TIK claims that Marxists are in favour of class-based socialism, where the working class overthrows the dictatorship of the capitalist class and replaces it with a workers' state, where the means of production are brought into common ownership, i.e. the dictatorship of the proletariat. Meanwhile, under Hitler's racial socialism, German workers should not look at their Aryan capitalist as an oppressor, but a national comrade. So capitalist private property is retained, as is wage labour, profit-making and markets. In 1922, Hitler gave us his definition of socialism. Whoever is prepared to make the national cause his own to such an extent that he knows no higher ideal than the welfare of the nation, whoever has understood our great national anthem, Deutschland über alles, to mean that nothing in the wide world surpasses, in his eyes, this Germany, people and land, that man is a socialist. So according to Hitler, socialism is basically another word for nationalism. So if we used his definition, capitalists, owners of the means of production, can easily be socialist if they operate their industries in the national interest. Now I don't need to tell anyone that this definition is totally antithetical to the definition used by Marx and the modern left. Of course, TIK and other revisionists are far too dishonest to admit to this. However, he cannot escape the pro-capitalist nature of Hitler's regime. Indeed, if you look at the national income share in the Third Reich, you find that TIK and other revisionists are completely wrong. According to William Scherer, the national income share from business and capital rose from 17.4% in 1932 to 26.6% in 1938. Meanwhile, the income share of workers fell from 56.9% to 53.6%, even though millions more were employed. So it turns out, if you look at the actual data, that the capitalist class were Hitler's beneficiaries. Adam Tooze also points this out in his book Wages of Destruction. As we have seen, profits were rising rapidly after 1933, and this opened attractive future prospects for German corporate management. At first, the profits were used to undo the damage done by the Depression. Then, from the late 1930s onwards, they financed an extraordinary investment boom, such as had never before been seen in German industrial history. What Hitler's regime positively enabled German business to do was to recover from the disastrous recession, to accumulate capital, and to engage in high-pressure development of certain key technologies, the technologies necessary to achieve the regime's twin objectives of increased self-sufficiency, autarky, and rearmament. Of course, this is not true capitalism according to TIK, because capitalism, as he says later in this video, has never truly existed. Ridiculous.
This idea that Marxism has nothing to do with race is equally incorrect. The capitalist knows that all commodities, however scurvy they may look, or however badly they may smell, are in faith and in truth money, inwardly circumcised Jews, and what is more, a wonderful means whereby out of money to make more money. That's right. Marx despised the Jews and thought capitalism was Jewish. And Hitler thought the exact same thing. Because this capital is international, its holders, the Jews, are international because of their being spread all over the world. And here everyone should actually throw up their hands in despair and say to themselves, if this capital is international because its holders, the Jews, are spread internationally all over the world, then it must be insanity to think that one will be able to fight this capital of the same members of this race internationally. And Marx is not only calling for the socialization of the people, he's calling for the removal of the Jews from society. As soon as society succeeds in abolishing the empirical essence of Judaism, huckstering and its conditions, the Jew becomes impossible because his consciousness no longer has an object. The social emancipation of the Jew is the emancipation of society from Judaism. And let's not forget that Hitler had read Marx's Das Kapital, which he says was what convinced him that he was in a fight against a real international and stock exchange capital which he believed was being run by the Jews. No wonder Goebbels declared 80 years later that all socialism is anti-Semitism. So I think it's quite ironic that some Marxists accused me of being a Jew hater, having zero evidence to back that accusation up, and only relying on the mistaken belief that National Socialism was capitalism, which it isn't. In reality, given what we've just seen, it would be fair to say that socialism is inherently anti-Semitic.
So TIK is claiming that Marxism is racist. That is totally false. Marx did write anti-Semitic and racist things, even though his two grandfathers were rabbis, but they were completely separate from the system he proposed. Also, the claim that he despised the Jews also needs to be considered, especially given the fact that he wrote an article in 1854 where he openly sympathized with the plight of the Jews of Jerusalem, who were not only living in poverty, but were being persecuted. Furthermore, Marx's own daughter, Eleanor Marx, proudly considered herself a Jewess and always acknowledged her father's Jewish heritage. The quote from a letter she wrote in 1890 to a group of socialist Jewish workers, "Dear comrades, I shall be very glad to speak at the meeting of November the 1st, the more glad that my father was a Jew." Also, to claim that socialism is anti-Semitic is indeed utterly moronic, as Engles pointed out in 1890. Furthermore, we are far too deeply indebted to the Jews. Leaving aside Hayden and Borden, Marx was a full-blooded Jew, Lassalle was a Jew, many of our best people are Jews. My friend Victor Adler, who is now atoning in a Viennese prison for his devotion to the cause of the proletariat, Edward Bernstein, editor of the London Social Democrat, Paul Sina, one of our best men in the Reichstag, people whom I am proud to call my friends, and all of them Jewish. As Engels pointed out, the socialist movement in Europe owed a great debt to Jewish people. This was also noted by the right. In his 1920 essay entitled Zionism vs. Bolshevism, Winston Churchill wrote, "In violent opposition to all this sphere of Jewish effort rise the schemes of the international Jews. The adherents of this sinister confederacy are mostly men reared up among the unhappy populations of countries where Jews are persecuted on account of their race. Most, if not all, of them have forsaken the faith of their forefathers, and divorced from their minds all spiritual hopes of the next world. This movement among the Jews is not new. From the days of Spartacus to those of Karl Marx, and down to Trotsky, Bela Khan, Rosa Luxemburg, and Emma Goldman. This worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development of envious malevolence and impossible equality has been steadily growing." Hitler wrote something similar to this in Mein Kampf. The Jewish doctrine of Marxism rejects the aristocratic principle of nature and replaces the eternal privilege of power and strength by the mass of numbers and their dead weight. Thus it denies the value of personality in man, contests the significance of nationality and race, and thereby withdraws from humanity, the premise of its existence and its culture. As a foundation of the universe, This doctrine would bring about the end of any order intellectually conceivable to man, and as in this greatest of all recognizable organisms, the result of an application of such a law could only be chaos. On Earth, it could only be destruction for the inhabitants of this planet. So both Churchill and Hitler associated international Jews with Marxism, a plot to destroy Western civilization, whilst Engles praised the Jewish community for their contribution to the socialist movement. It should also be pointed out that only right-wing pro-capitalist parties banned Jews from participating in their movements. For example, when the Weimar Republic was formed, all the German conservative parties merged into the German National People's Party. One of their first acts was to ban Jews from joining. So despite TIK's revisionist history, Jews played an active part in the left-wing socialist movement. Meanwhile, right-wing parties sought to persecute them and deprive them of their agency. As for the Hitler quotes, it was clear that he was associating Jews with a particular type of capital, finance and loan capital. He often contrasted international capital, which he associated with the Jews, with industrial capital. To quote one of his speeches that took place in 1920, "What does the word industrial capital really mean, ladies and gentlemen? People often accuse us, particularly in the factories, you don't fight against the industrial capital, just against finance and loan capital. And most people don't understand that one must not fight against industrial capital. What is industrial capital? It is a constantly changing factor, a relative concept. Once it was a needle and a thread, a workshop, and a couple of cents in ready money, which a tailor in Nuremberg possessed in the 13th century. It was a sum that made work possible, that is, tools, workshops, and a certain amount of money in order to survive for a period of time. Gradually, this small workshop became a big factory, but workshops and tools, machines and factories have, per se, no value, able to produce value, but are means to an end. What produces value is work, and the few cents which made it possible to survive difficult times and buy some fabrics, multiplied through time, stand before us today. We call it capital, for continued operation in bad times, that is, working capital. So to Hitler, good industrial capital was to be praised, but loan and finance capital was Jewish and ought to be condemned. Now, the interesting thing is, if you cast your mind back to the beginning of the video, is that TIK claimed that shareholder companies were socialist. Where do people buy and sell shares? The stock exchange. So TIK is against the same capital Hitler was against. I should also make this clear. Associating Jewish people with finance and loan capital is anti-Semitic, especially when you consider that charging interest is described as a sin in the Torah.
And this makes sense, given the fact that socialism is designed to divide society into hostile groups in order to exploit them and allow the accusers a chance to gain power. Workers versus their bosses, Aryans versus Jews, men versus women, the list goes on. Now,
pointing out that we live in a class-based society is the same as telling racist lies about Jewish people. Utter stupidity.
As I explained in the public versus private video, when you collectivize the people in this way, they become the governing body of whatever territory they're on. So they become the state. Marxist fascists rejected my definition of the word state, even though I gave the Oxford Dictionary definition of the word. State, noun, a nation or territory considered as an organised political community under one government. An organised political community on a piece of territory, such as a collective farm, would be classed as a state. But this was simply rejected. Well, for starters, the reason the dictionary exists is so that you can use it to learn the meanings of words. If you reject the language that we speak, deciding that words do not mean what they mean, then we're not going to be able to communicate. This was the original issue. Socialists didn't know the true meaning and definition of socialism. I have gone back through the literature and the sources all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome to confirm to you what it was, and it turns out that, yes, socialists never say what real socialism is because they don't know what real socialism is.
It's sad that I have to inform the world's greatest historian that in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, capitalism and socialism did not exist. Also, using the dictionary in this context is not a great idea. Why? Because as we have seen, if someone calls themselves a socialist or a capitalist, it is best to look up how they define the term. Also, using the dictionary does not really help TIK's case, especially when quite a number of dictionaries label fascism and National Socialism extreme right authoritarian movements.
And if they understood basic economics, they wouldn't be socialists. That's why I'm no longer a socialist, because I did my homework.
Oh dear, the basic economics meme. First of all, if we use TIK's definition of socialism, both Donald Trump and Boris Johnson would be socialist. Indeed, even Hayek would be a socialist. After all, he advocated for a state-run healthcare system in the road to serve them. He was also a supporter of Pinochet's capitalist dictatorship, where the state not only murdered 3,000 people, but also tortured children in order to defend the interests of the capitalist class. It is also worth noting that Pinochet's coup is praised on Mises.org, another site that likes to dribble on about so-called freedom. So yes, whilst the only government Marx supported was the democratic Paris Commune, Hayek and Mises actually supported murderous state-run dictatorships that were designed to repress the working class in favour of the capitalist class. Now, as the title suggests, this video was about TIK's absurd definitions of socialism and capitalism. His actual video is 5 hours long, 5 hours of using his ridiculous definitions. Now, on the debate of whether the Third Reich was socialist, it is not really much of a debate at all. All historians acknowledge that there was a powerful capitalist class in Germany and that they made record profits, so clearly a capitalist state. The debate is really about how much control these capitalists had. Now, Christoph Buchmann and Jonas Schnurner of the University of Mannheim wrote a brilliant paper about this. Their research indicates that the capitalists had quite a bit of autonomy, even during the war, citing examples where capitalist companies refused the requests of the state because they considered the ventures unprofitable. Even though, as we know, the Third Reich was fighting a total war for its survival. So in conclusion, TIK's 5-hour-long video, where he constantly repeats these definitions, is an example of bad history. Indeed, perhaps I will, but not right away, go back and answer other parts of TIK's ridiculous video, where he misrepresents Marx's labour theory of value and the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, for example. All the time he claims that Hitler's policy of giving the peasants state-protected private property, i.e. the state hereditary farm law, was an example of socialism, or that the Enabling Act abolished private property in Germany, or the no true privatization claims. There is still a lot to cover. But for now, I feel that pointing out that his definitions of socialism and capitalism, which he uses to justify his foolish points throughout his 5-hour video, is enough for now. After all, getting the formula wrong, like getting definitions wrong, stuffs up the whole project.